And as we continue with our special program, let's tune in with our headquarters in Caracas with Gladys Quesada, who's ready for us.
Thanks for the contact, Luis. Thanks for this moment hearing from the South and teleSUR English and this special coverage of the Consultative Referendum on the Guyana Essequiba. This is a key moment in Venezuelan history because all the people is defending the territory and the integrity of the territory, and also the people is taking an active stance on this dispute, this territorial dispute with Guyana. Now is my honor and my pleasure to receive Diego Sequera, who is an international analyst and also an expert on Venezuelan issues and Venezuelan topics. Be welcome, Diego.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Sort of an expert.
Well, we try. We all try. Okay, so Diego, one of the main topics that today is the worries or maybe the talks and the dialogues among Venezuelans is this referendum on the Guyana Essequiba region. I know that many people is consulting the internet, Googling, and trying to find the answers. And as we know, the Guyana Essequiba, better known as the Essequibo region, is a landmark place, is a territory, is a region between what we know legally as Venezuela and what we know legally as Guyana, the Cooperative Republic of Guyana.
Correct.
So historically, it has been administered by Guyana, and it belongs, even though the request and the claims and the dispute, to the Venezuelan map. But let's go first, before we talk about that, let's talk about the beginning of the history on the Guyana Essequiba region. I have an interesting fact that I wanted to discuss with you. Back in the Elizabeth, the first times in the United Kingdom, she sent, as we know, she sent explorers, rangers even, to these regions, to the unknown new world. And back then, Sir Walter Raleigh, he came here and he explored, and he was the first one to write a document on the Guyana and the Essequibo region also.
Correct.
And he described the supposed richness and the supposed resources and the findings of gold. From that point on, which are the main highlights, the main points of this construction of Guyana and this appropriation of the Guyana Essequiba and how it has developed for Venezuela and Guyana also?
Yes, well, first of all, you can see each and every map, even pre-independent Venezuela. The most important land delimitations came after late 18th century with the Bourbonic reforms during Charles III, Carlos III. And that's what's actually when Venezuela had like a new administrative delimitation of its own territory, in which of course included parts of what's now called the Essequibo, and also parts of what now it's currently Brazil and Colombia also. I mean, it was
to the south.
Yes, exactly. And then to the west, it was a way more larger territory back then, and that's like the basics, and that's let's call it the cartography, which the independence is based on. And in this case, La Guyana Essequiba was also part of the La Guyana, which actually was decisive during the independence. It was like what they call the Third Republic. During our independence, we had like a first, a second, and a third republic, because the first two projects basically collapsed because of administrative, political complications and problems and whatnot, and contradictions also.
Okay.
And on the second, that was the first republic, and that failed that would be 1812. And then we had a second republic, which social issues actually overwhelmed the most valuable causes of independence, because all the class issues came up, and it was like the hardest lesson for all the liberators, starting with Bolivar himself, something he acknowledges several times. There's a lot of written documentary testimony of this experience. And then we have the Third Republic, which actually basically started in La Guyana, which is Bolivar state. Would be like the right bank of the Orinoco River. We also, their own limits would be the Essequibo River back then. And it was the base from where not only the military campaigns afterwards started liberating the territory, but also where the republic was founded by itself. I mean, the concept of republic and the legal structure of it and everything else, and actually the fate of the republic started right there. I mean, in Angostura, in Ciudad Bolívar currently. Okay. But it's the same region, and it was part of it. And even back then, we started to have a lot of issues with the first encounters, let's call it that way, with the U.S. vessels and also the British vessels, the British Crown, because we had also British fighters that came over to Venezuela during those campaigns. But that's when it started, the first context, but not only context, but also the first strifes, conflicts between us. And because, of course, there was a lot of interest in what was going on. You have first, I mean, the Sir Walter Raleigh writings are like 200 years before that. And so it was already in sight of the British Crown as to what extent and to what interest this area, which is very hard to rule, to appease, because it's, well,
to control.
Yeah, to control, basically, and especially if you are an embattled republic that just came after independence and with a huge rate of deaths and destruction, because that's how it was here in Venezuela.
Yeah, and the power imbalance, if you're going to think about it, the power imbalance, because the UK and the British Empire, it is an empire. It has years.
No, for sure. And I mean, we're talking about that. I mean, the major powerhouse during those years. I'm talking about exactly. the half of, a bit more before the half, but most of the 19th century, the major power was actually the United Kingdom.
Yes.
And especially in trade, and also in control of the trade routes, and control of the resources that they're interested in, and how they were going to extract them from some places. And also they were pretty masterful and able to find loopholes and voids, legal voids, into where to go into them and exploit them from their own benefit. And that's actually the history of a lot of places, not only in Latin America. You can also think about, for example, Gibraltar in Spain. I mean, it's the same thing, strategic places with strategic meanings, be it geographical or in a matter of resources. That's how the Essequibo region actually came into their sight, because there were also further explorations that showed in that back in the day that the huge amount of resources, and we're talking about mineral and the ones they were able to detect back then, as in gold, for example. Basically, and most importantly, gold, but not only gold. It was also about geography. It was also about location, and it was also about how near from their own enclaves they used to have before that they grew the same logical interest they had in other critical areas of the, let's call it, I'm not friendly with this term, but let's call it that way because it's easier, with the Western Hemisphere in general.
Well,
think about Belize, for example. Think about Uruguay. Think about Malvinas. Think about Brazil. You have a lot of places where British diplomacy basically shaped territorially a lot of places, because they were actually able to, wield the power that was decisive enough to impose their will.
Yeah, they tried to do that with Cuba too.
Exactly.
Yeah, they appropriated Havana and the surrounding territories for 6 months, and they did the same.
Exactly.
Until they had to go away.
Exactly. So it's the same framework. You can also think about Argentina back then, even Buenos Aires back then. I mean, there was actually the Argentine independence has like this kernel that's very important, based on the struggle against the Brits who occupied Buenos Aires back then. I mean, I'm talking about 1810, 1812. But that's how that influence is visible physically, because you also had the other one, which was diplomacy and also covert politics. I mean, the first covert groups, let's call it intelligence, I mean, it's not in the modern sense of, you know, intelligence agencies, but it was basically kind of like that, and how they influenced key actors and key people who were also take up a stand about some issue, a current issue, and how these UK spies or influencers, to call it in a more contemporary way, would try to shape up things not only on the ground but also on paper.
Yeah, exactly.
So you have this quarrel that happened in the late 19th century in Venezuela. It's more like a 20-year situation. There's a dispute between Venezuela and the British Foreign Office from that moment on, which, well, that's like the first starting point of what we're at where we at right now. That's those intrigues, those pressures, those interests, and those, we can call it even defeats from the Venezuelan side in the foreign policy battlefield, were the ones that shaped what happened in 1899, finally. And it had to do also with how, well, some Venezuelan actors within the foreign ministry actually conceded willfully in favor of foreign powers to give away or to silently acknowledge the situation as it was back then.
Exactly. I think there is a parallel between Venezuela and Cuba, and I beg your pardon if I do many parallels in Latin America and in Cuba in this specific case. But it's the same. Once and once again, we see how the main powers in that time, they took this legal voids you were talking about, they took it and they fill it with their reasons, their justifications to appropriate of their territories. It's the core of the new ways of colonization.
Yeah, exactly. It's the pattern of aggression. That's like a British historian, by the way, named Kate Hudson, talked about how they did the same thing, for example, because this is basically a template. They did the same thing in Kosovo. I mean, 100 years afterwards, you know what I mean? Is that this is the basis which this rationale and this methodology actually was installed and was so effective and also perfected in time, you know, and you can see that even before the Essequibo, before Guyana, you can see it in other places. You have like this very smart, very aggressive and complex figures like Lord Ponsonby, you know, the guy who basically created Uruguay but also created Belgium. These guys were expert in balkanizing territory in order to benefit their own access to resources or to political control, political leverage on the recently independent nations. So exactly. That's also in this case, and also that's what actually it's the the background of the
politics, the ways.
No, in what happened in Paris, the Paris.
The Paris Agreement.
Yeah, the Paris Agreement. I mean, that's how it actually happened. You have actually the one who defended Venezuela was actually the U.S. based on the Monroe Doctrine precisely.
Yeah.
This is actually one of the examples of how the U.S. replies to this element.
Yeah, precisely. I want to save that main topic you were speaking about then.
Sure.
Because the Monroe policy, the Monroe Doctrine, it has another chapter on its own.
For sure. Well, and in a way, this was another chapter. Maybe could look apparently in favor of the Americas, but it wasn't.
Yeah, in favor of who
was able to control and manage the situation afterwards. That's what the dispute between these two.
And in which ways? But that is a topic for a second time, because now we are going to give Havana back the signal, and I'm back to you, Luis. So the stage and the